Chapter 2, right? All right, Daniel chapter 2. We're going to continue on a series that we started a little while back. And what we started off dealing with was the 5 courses of punishment that's laid out in Leviticus chapter 26. And the reason that we started doing this is just because it was based on a question that we had as we were going through the series previous to that, where we're talking about the Gentile nations and the sons of God. And there is a connection between the Gentile nations, of which we're a part of, and the sons of God, really specifically dealing with those fallen angels. All right, and what we talked about is what takes place is when God, in Romans chapter 1, he tells us in the first little bit of Romans chapter 1, he takes us all the way back to the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. Right, in the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, what we find out is God creates the heaven and the earth, and then he inhabits it with folks. What happens is, of course, we know that Satan, who fell sometime during that passage in Genesis chapter 1, we find that out by going out and studying Job and some other chapters and other things as well. And what we find out is that after God creates man and says, I want you to multiply and have dominion and subdue, there's an issue that Satan comes along and he says, what? Yea, hath God said. Adam and Eve partake of the fruit, and at that point in time, man falls. And of course, we know the things that's taking place because of that in the world in which we live in today as a result of them giving over the kingdom that he gave them to be ruler of for fruit. And it was based on bad doctrine is really what it is. And that's what it starts off with is, are you sure that's what God said? And of course, what we find out in chapter 11, what does man do? He goes and builds a tower, says, let's build a tower to reach up to heaven. And God says, let's go down and confuse their language so that they will actually disperse and do what I asked them to do, and that's to spread, multiply, and replenish the earth. Then in chapter 12, what does God do? He calls out one man, Abram. All right, and he says to Abram, I'm going to make of thee a great nation. And what God does from that point all the way up until you get to the book of Acts chapter 7, God is dealing with creating a kingdom here on the earth through men, specifically dealing with the nation of Israel. And that's what God's doing. And in Romans, he says, this is what I've done with the Gentiles is I've given them up. I've given them up, and I give them over to a reprobate mind. You want to live in a life that doesn't include me? Have at it. And he says, but I'm going to show you what a nation can look like that has me as their God. And so that's why he sets up the nation of Israel. Now, what we found out as we go through there in Leviticus chapter 26, God lays out that there's 5 courses of punishment, chastisement, if you will, that he lays out in Leviticus chapter 26. And one of the things that we've talked about is those judgments weren't, here's judgment 1, all right, it's over. Here's judgment 2. It's over. Here's judgment 3. During Jesus Christ's earthly ministry, all 5 of those courses of punishment was taking place at the exact same time with the nation of Israel at that particular time. They were living in all 5 courses of that judgment at that time. They were concurrent. They all worked together. They weren't separate from one another, but they actually, and we talked about it before, that whenever he starts that first course, that goes until you get the kingdom. The second course starts, and it's just added on top of it, right? And it's not that he's going to stop one and then start another one. And then you've got a third judgment, a fourth judgment, and a fifth judgment. Now, one of the things that we have to think about that is what we know is there is a particular time where God says, I'm going to put that stuff on hold. And that's really an important thing to think about, because not only has God inserted the time of which we call the dispensation of the grace of God, he's actually put on pause the 5 courses of judgment for the nation of Israel. That's important for us to know. So then because there's an idea, well, I won't get into that. But when we take a look at that, there's something that God's doing completely different today. But what do we know? He's going to finish that out with the nation of Israel. Otherwise, can he be faithful to his word? No. So that's one of the things that we want to be able to learn from this. And Romans chapter 15, verse 4 tells us what? The things that were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience, the comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. Well, hope in what? Hope in a God that cannot lie, right? We looked at Hebrews chapter 6 last time, and it's one of those things that, is it possible for God to lie? No. And we find that out. Paul talks about it in Titus, and then the writer of the book of Hebrews also tells us in Hebrews chapter 6 that it's impossible for God to lie. And so then that's one of those things that we want to make sure that we know is he finished with the nation of Israel? And the answer, of course, is no. Now, what we find out here, and this is where we find ourselves during this fifth course of punishment, here you've got, there's 70 years. Go grab Daniel chapter 9 real quick. We'll get to Daniel 2 here in a second. In Daniel chapter 9, where we find ourselves now is when they go off into Babylonian captivity. Does the nation of Israel know how long they're going to be in Babylonian captivity? Yes. Notice, Daniel chapter 9, verse 1, in the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of the seed of the Medes, which was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by books the number of the years whereof the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolation of Jerusalem. Now, what he's talking about there is you go back to Jeremiah chapter 25, and what we read is, what is it that he tells us in Jeremiah 25 is that they're going to be in captivity for how long? 70 years. Now, that's something that Daniel understands because he had the book of Jeremiah. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we went through Jeremiah chapter 36, and we found out when you take a look at the book of Jeremiah, what happened to the original version of the Jeremiah? It was cut up, tossed on fire, and then Jeremiah wrote another copy of it. Well, and then we mentioned yesterday in Jeremiah chapter 51, verses 61 and on, what happens to that copy? Tie a rope around it, hook it up to a rope, toss it into the river. That second one's gone. Well, how in the world is it that Daniel has a book of Jeremiah that he can read here and understand that there are 70 years that they're going to be? Because there were another copies, right? So when we talk about that and think about that, it's a proven fact that God said He's going to preserve His word through multiplicity of copies over and over and over again. Because if you think about this, if I take and I create like a Bible study or whatever, and I put it on cassette tape, if I make one copy of that and I send that out, what happens to that one copy? It's gone forever. Somebody destroys it, it's gone forever. But if I make 10 copies and I send those 10 out, what do I have? Now I have copies. Now in order to destroy that Bible study, what do you have to do? You have to know first how many copies were made, and you'd have to be able to find all 10 copies and destroy all 10 of them to be able to stop that being taught, right? Or that being learned. And that's what God's done with His book. He said, well, I'm going to make my book, and I'm going to make it possible for my people to know my mind and understand what I'm doing. And I'm going to do that this way, and everybody has a copy. The kings for Israel, one of the first things that they do as soon as they take the throne is they get their own copy of the book of God. Right? Huh? Yeah, and they copy it out themselves, right? And you think about that. That's one of the things that we see, that's how God's going to preserve His word. So how is it that Daniel had a book of Jeremiah when the first and the second one were both destroyed? Is there were other copies made. And so he understands where he is in the timeline of what God's asking them to do. Now, when you go back and you look at Leviticus chapter 26, what was the one thing that God said over and over again, that I will stop doing this if you do what? Repent. And what's the nation of Israel do each and every time? Not so much, right? And so then what we find is in the book of Daniel, we find Daniel doing what? The thing that the nation is supposed to be doing. And we see that as we go through. Now, part of what we've got going on is they're in this 70 years of captivity, and that's where we find ourselves here in Daniel chapter 1. And back up to chapter 1 real quick. In Daniel chapter 1, notice in the verse 1, It says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, into Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And you notice that lowercase g there. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. Now, of course, we talked about when we're going through that other series about the Gentile nations and the sons of God. What we mentioned back there is you have all these fallen gods, sons of gods, if you will, these fallen angels, and what God does is says, all right, Gentile nation 1, you get this God. Gentile nation 2, you get this God, over and over and over again. They're given gods, and God says, I'm going to give the nations over to them, and I'm going to make one nation, and they're mine. And I'm going to set them up, and I'm going to make them different from every other nation. And so then what we do is we look at these nations, and what do we know? What do we know about this nation here, or this kingdom here specifically, about Babylon is what? He has what? He's got his God. And he's got a what? He's got a temple to his God. And what has he got? What has he done? He's taken things out of the house of God that belong to these people, and he's brought them into that place there. That's what we see here when he says, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with part of the vessels of the house of God, capital G, which he carried in the land of Shinar to the house of his God, lowercase g. So they besieged, and that idea of the spoils of war, what's he do? He takes things that belong there and bring them over here and adds them to his own God's temple, lowercase g, which is this up here, right? We talked about that a little while back. So whenever we see these things taking place, when we drop down in the passage in chapter 1 here, what do we find out is you've got the King Nebuchadnezzar has people training folks that they brought from the nation of Israel, teaching them their ways and teaching them their tongue. Now what's interesting is, I think it's beginning in chapter 2 through chapter 7 in the book of Daniel was originally written in Chaldean. So that's kind of interesting. So part of Daniel's written in Hebrew, part of it's written in Chaldean. So it's an interesting thing that you've got there. And then you start, then that brings up issues of like translations and things like that. Yeah.
I can't confirm this, but I've always heard that Chaldean is very similar to Aramaic.
That I'm not sure. Aramaic was something during Christ's time and things like that. I don't know about that personally. So, if you can, let us know. But the idea there that I want you to see is, what do we have? We've got Hebrew and Chaldean written in this one book. And then when you stop and you think about what we've got now is we've got an English translation of 2 different languages in this one book. And that's an interesting thing to think about. That gets into some translation stuff. Well, I won't get off on that tangent. I really want to go down that road, but we're not going to. But what happens is they're teaching these things, and they actually change the names of these folks. And, of course, Daniel and all those guys, we talked about their names before. And what they do is they change their names, and the purpose of that is to do what? To change their identification, saying you're no longer identified with that God, but you're identified with our God, and trying to completely change things. Now, in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, right? And this is where we've come to so far. In Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and what's he do? He asks for people to come and tell him what the dream is, and then explain what the actual dream is. Now, when we look at this, Daniel chapter 2, verse 36, Daniel comes in and says, here's the dream and here's the interpretation. Let's start in verse 31. Thou, O king, sawest and behold a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. The image's head was of fine gold, His breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Now, when you stop and you look at this, what do we have? We've got a head of gold, right? We have arms and breast of silver, and then we have thighs, yeah.
Belly of bronze.
Yeah, the thighs and the belly of bronze. And then you've got legs of iron, and then you got what?
Feet and toes.
The feet and the toes are iron and clay, right?
Yes.
So you've got iron and clay. Now, what's interesting about this is there's 1, 2, 3. Technically, there's 4 kingdoms, right? Normally we think of it as 5. But if you think about this, this is iron mixed with clay. So it's still the 4th kingdom. They've just added something to it. All right, so we've gone through and we've talked about some of those things. Now, the interpretation of it is, and we're going to go through this as well, but verse 36, this is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. Thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field, and the fowls of the heaven, hath he given into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold. Now, what do we know about that head of gold? That's who? All right, Babylon, all right? Do we know of any other time that Babylon shows up in Scripture? It shows up a few times, right? You got it over there in Revelation, all right? Mystery Babylon the Great, and there's some things that's taking place there. What's interesting is what we see here is there is actually a state religion that is instituted right there. Hold your place there. Go to chapter 3 real quick. Daniel chapter 3. And I just want us to notice some things and we'll back up. Notice Daniel chapter 3, verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon. Now, there's a bunch of stuff here that we can get into, but what is it that he makes an image of? Gold. Gold in Scripture oftentimes is a type of what? Deity. I want to set up this kingdom. In fact, you think about this. When the nation of Israel comes out of Egypt, what is it that they do? They make a golden calf. Well, and they say, this is the God that brought us out of the land of Egypt, right? While Moses is up there getting the 10 Commandments, they're dancing around it when he gets back. And it's like, I don't know how that happened. Everybody just brought me gold, and then we got this calf. Right? And why is it that it's a calf? That's Satan. Right? You go back to Genesis chapter 3, and he's what? He is cursed above the beasts of the field, not the slithering snake, right? There's a reason there's verses that say that. So when we look at this, what's he setting up is what? I'm setting up a universal religion. And what he's actually doing is he's setting up the image to represent himself. Now, who is it that's one day going to set up in the throne of God and proclaim to be God? And he's going to set up a religion, right? And there, we understand the foreshadowing and all that stuff. Is it anything new? The answer is no, right? But notice this. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and breadth thereof 6 cubits. Notice those next few words. He set it up. Who set it up? He did. Notice, keep on going. Verse 2. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent to gather together the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the province to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had what? Then the princes, the governors, and the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together unto the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king what? And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And you see this over and over and over again. You stop and you think about this. Was there another time where somebody set up to do something? Well, what were they doing back in Genesis chapter 11? They're going around and they're building a tower, and what they're doing is, then they're building a tower there. What are they actually doing? They're creating a universal religion. Everybody's one language, one tongue, one all that stuff. And we keep on going. Notice verse 4. Then an herald cried aloud, to you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. And you see that phrase shows up over and over and over again, right? What are they doing? Here's your worship service. When you hear the music, bow down to the image. People doing that stuff this morning, and they don't even realize what they're doing. Well, you stop and you think, who was it that was supposed to be the music leader for the universe? Would have been who? He had all that stuff built into him, right? You go back and you can read that. He was to be the one that would lead the song of Holy, Holy, Holy. Now he's corrupted it. And of course, we've talked about his corrupted wisdom and how he's taking things that belong to God, brings them over here and says what? This is what we're supposed to be doing with it. And he's setting this up. Same stuff, right? Verse 6, and whoso falleth not down and worshipeth shall the same hour be cast in the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Therefore at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. You notice there, all the people, the nations, and the languages. Everybody's in on this. Everybody that's there, they're all in on it. Well, of course, one, right? Notice, keep on going. Wherefore at that time certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews. They spake and said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. Thou, O king, hast made a decree that every man that shall hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth, that he should be cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom thou hast set up over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, lowercase g, right? Again, what was it we started off in Daniel chapter 1 is Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's meat and the king's drink. And what's he doing? We're standing our ground here too. And one of the things, there's a song in the back of our book that I want to learn, and I want us to learn one day. It's called Dare to be a Daniel. In the midst of whatever takes place in our world, what should we do? We should purpose in ourselves not to defile ourselves. You know, there's a saying, I've heard it before, that we are ambassadors for Christ. Why would we want to lower ourselves to be mere kings on earth? But yet, oftentimes, we do things like that. And what is it that Daniel and the folks there with him are doing what? They're not doing this. To do what? O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar in his rage and fury commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spake and said unto them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Do not ye serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? Now stop and you think. Place yourself in a situation where somebody comes up and says, is it true that you're not worshiping my God, but you're worshiping another one? How would you respond? Sitting here this morning, the United States of America, it'd be easy to say, yeah, I'd say, no, I'm not going to. What I want you to think about is there going to come a time during that tribulation period where that's actually going to happen to people? You go read Matthew chapter 10, Christ says to the 12, what? You're going to go before these people and they're going to do what? Their whole goal is to destroy you. And they're going to be going through that. And so you stop and you think, what should a believing remnant of the nation of Israel look like, sound like? Is these three guys right here. Now you stop and think, are there other folks in Israel that have bowed down to that image? But there's some. Here you get to see what the believing remnant's going to look like. And you see this again at the middle of verse 15. He brings up that issue of this image which I have made, and verse 18, which thou hast set up. Go real quick. Go real quick to 1 Corinthians. First Corinthians chapter 12. And think about some things. And I guess we'll make these lowercase g's up here, right? I had them big G's for Gentiles, but yeah. So you got these lowercase g's up here that are given to those Gentiles. Now you stop and you think about that. Is it possible to be led by one of those guys right there? And then we could mistakenly say, well, that's the God of the Bible that's leading me to do that. So we got to be careful when somebody says, well, God's leading me to do this. Well, which big case G or small case G, right? Notice this. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 1. Now concerning spiritual gifts, brethren, I would not have you ignorant. Ye know that ye were Gentiles, carried away unto these dumb idols. Now, for time's sake, we're not going to run through this, but I want you to see this. What is it that Nebuchadnezzar set up was a image that he had made, right? This issue of dumb idols, it's not that, I can't believe you'd believe that stupid stuff. It's a dumb idol because when you think about something being dumb in Scripture, what's he talking about? Can't speak. So when he sets up this image, when Nebuchadnezzar sets up this image, can this image talk to him? No. And that's what he's talking about here. And notice there he says, ye know that ye were Gentiles, notice, carried away unto these dumb idols, even as ye were what? Well, who's leading people to go after these dumb idols and setting them up and saying, well, we're going to fall down and worship them? There's this whole system that we've talked about. Get to Ephesians chapter 2. And this is part of the reason why I want us to be able to think about this. When we start off back here, what we start off with is politically the times of the Gentiles. All right, and we've talked about that before. Do we have Gentile nations that are ruling and reigning and all that stuff now? Some might think so, but here's what I want you to think about. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 1. And you hath he quickened, who were dead in trespasses and sins, wherein in time past ye walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now worketh in the children of disobedience. Now, what I want you to stop and think about is, there is a system out here that when God created Lucifer, was he perfect? He was good, right? But what happened is he's full of wisdom, full of beauty. Well, what happens to his wisdom? We've talked about it, looked at it before. It's corrupted, and now he's who? He's no longer Lucifer. So, we kind of don't call him Lucifer if we're talking about the fallen state of him, right? Back and forth. So his wisdom's corrupted. His wisdom now is what? That's what he sold to all these lowercase g's up here. And they bought it. He trafficked it. Said, I'm going to sell my information to you. And they bought it, hook, line, and sinker, and said, give us a position. By the way, when he comes to Eve, he tells her, you see the angels out there, the sons of God? God's hiding something from you. You want to be like them? Partake of this fruit. And he sells to her the exact same thing that he sold to them. He said, you see them out there? That tells me what? She can see them. She knows something about the sons of God. She can see them. He says, you want a position in my kingdom? I'll give it to you. Just partake of the fruit. And what's she do? She partakes. Then turns to her husband, who, by the way, was set up to be king. And she turns to him and says, partake. And what's he do? In complete and total rebellion against what God said, he partook. Now, we find out in some other passages and things that she was deceived, but he did it willingly. All right, and we can talk about that. Question. What? What position? He would fall into that point, yeah.
He had already fallen when he presented that to them.
Yeah, yeah. So, and that's one of the things why it's important. A couple years ago we were talking about when was it that Lucifer fell? We know he fell, and so by the time you get to Genesis 3, he'd already fallen. He's in that corrupted state where he's now Satan, the great deceiver, and all that. Huh?
I said, how did he get that position when he fell?
He had a position. He had a position, but not that one. He's corrupted that. He's corrupted that. Yeah. And so.
He didn't fall into that position.
No.
He already had that position. He just
Corrupted it. Yeah. And so that's why in Job when we see that the heavens are unclean in his sight is because these positions that these sons of God are part of, they're corrupted because of him corrupting that position. Yeah. Yeah. And so then that's that issue of when did he do that? We talked about that. But yeah, he's corrupted that through his corrupted wisdom, and he's gone and sold that. And so each of the sons of God that followed him, their positions are now corrupted. And that's why the heavens are unclean in his sight. And by the way, and that's why those are Ephesians 1, Colossians 1 talks about those positions. And one of these days, God's going to take these lowercase g's out, and he's going to put a saint from the body of Christ in that position. All right? Each one of these, one day, is going to be held by a saint of the Most High God. Member of the body of Christ. Us. Right? One of these days, that course is what? Gone. What happens to him and his corruption? Gone. And what are you left with? Reconciliation of the heavens. And after all this, when Christ comes back, reconciliation of the earth. It's Ephesians 1. Yeah.
So is it fair to say in general, you're saying that he is creating the body of Christ to form his eventual eternal government? That's what he's doing.
Yeah.
We're going to be part of that.
Yeah.
He's filling in positions.
Yeah. And so then you had Adam down here who was set to be king on the earth. to rule and reign and subdue it. Well, if you have to subdue something, that means that there's an enemy out there that you have to go and subdue to get it. So God sets Adam up, and what Satan do is he comes and says, here's this fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And Adam says, all right, I'll take it. And at that point, when we see Satan show up in Job and says, I'm in the earth walking to and fro, he's saying, I own it. And I own all these positions up here too.
So is the judgment seat, without getting off into that subject, but is,
Well, we're talking about that this morning anyway, so that's fine. Go ahead.
yeah, but is the judgment seat then, is partly or fully gonna help determine what position each of us will have there, right?
It will. And we'll talk about that this morning. So yeah. So it will, that's where those positions, all that, we'll talk about that a little bit more. So that's another reason why I want to go through this stuff. Because when you go through Daniel, there's a lot of stuff in Daniel that's dealing with everything down here, but we also get a glimpse of some stuff that's taking place out there. And what Satan is trying to do is from those positions govern down through here. And what God's going to do, at the beginning, God tells Adam and Eve and Satan, he's there, he tells them what? I'm going to get this back. And I've got a plan to do it. And here's the best part. He lays it out in Scripture and says, here's my plan to get the earth back. And Satan said, well, all I got to do is just get rid of the seed. And when Christ goes to the cross, Satan thinks what? I got the seed, so I get to keep the earth. We've got some time period that goes on, and God says, by the way, the thing that you thought you won with, I'm going to use that to reclaim the earth. And by the way, I decided way back here before I even created the heaven and the earth that I'm going to regain those heavenly positions as well through that same event. And he never knew that plan out there. Satan never knew that plan. He knew all I got to do is Genesis 3 is what? The seed of the woman. So Satan thinks, if I can destroy the seed, I win. So what do you have? Cain and Abel. What takes place? I'm going to get the seed right off the bat. Well, what we find out in Galatians is none of those were the seed. Who's the seed? He's the seed that God was talking about back in Genesis 3 and all along. And so when Satan has Jesus Christ crucified, when he accomplishes that, based on what we see here in Ephesians 2, the course of this world, Satan had a plan for this world too. And how he's going to go about doing that. And it's according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now worketh in the children of disobedience. So what we see down here with Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 2 is what? A child of disobedience worshiping the system and the people, or not the people, but the sons of God, those fallen angels, and ultimately who? That's the gods that he's talking about, that he's setting this image up for. And it's interesting when we see those things, but that's where all that stuff comes from. So back in Daniel, chapter 3, when we see that stuff being laid out of this image that Nebuchadnezzar sets up, and we know the rest of the event that takes place with the fiery furnace. And so then one of the things, go back to Daniel chapter 2, one of the things that we notice there is, and this all goes along with that. So we know that Babylon's that head, right? In chapter 2, verse 40, we left off at verse 30, or let's do verse 39. Verse 39, and after thee shall rise another kingdom inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, for as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things. And as iron that breaketh all these, shall it break in pieces and bruise. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, notice it doesn't say that there's another kingdom there. It says, and whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it of the strength of iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. And the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay. So the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. Now, again, that's what I want us to be able to see is we're told what those first three kingdoms are. Hold your place here. Go over real quick to Daniel 7. Daniel 7, notice we've got verse 1, Daniel chapter 7, verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed. Then he wrote the dream and told the sum of the matters. Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of the heaven strove upon the great sea, and four great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another. The first was like a lion, and had eagle's wings. I beheld the wings thereof were plucked out, and I was lifted up from the earth, and made stand upon the feet as a man, and man's heart was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second, like to a bear, and it raised up itself on one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I beheld, and lo, another like a leopard, which had upon the back of its 4 wings of a fowl. The beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly. And it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, if in this horn were eyes like the eyes of man, and a mouth speaking great things. Now, there's a lot of stuff that's taking place here. And what I want us to notice is, what we see in the first little bit is man's view of what's going on, and here's God's view. Now, what's interesting is these 4 beasts are going to show up in Revelation, right? So there's something else that's taking place here. One of the things that I want us to see is down here in verse 7. It says, and I saw in the night visions, and there's this issue of the night. In Matthew, there's no way. If I could stop time, that would be fantastic. But what we see is there's this issue of a vision by night. There's this night vision. Now, in Matthew, as we're going through it, one of the things that we've talked about is we get to a point when Christ is here, He is the light of the world. When He's crucified, buried, and risen again, right? He comes back for 40 days, and then He ascends unto the Father and sits to the right hand of God the Father. And when the light's gone, what's left? Darkness. So what this is doing is, because Daniel says, here's this vision by night, and you see in verse 7, after this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast. What's he taking us to is this out here. And we'll see that. Now, obviously, does Daniel know anything about the dispensation of the grace of God? No. And so then when we see this, there are things that takes place here that I want us to be able to keep in mind and think about as we go through this. There's just not enough time to get through all these things. But what we are told as we go through there, these three we're told about. This last one, we're not really told who that is yet. Right? Huh? The last one. Because they're one. Right? Because it's one split into two. So you got the iron, and then what happens with the iron is clay's mixed in with it. So it's still the same kingdom, but it's now not as strong as it was originally. And so one of the things that we're going to see is how many legs are there? There's two, right? And so then what you've got there is, we brought up the last time, those legs, there's, and I'd said last time, and I want to fix this before we finish. We were talking about it yesterday. Gary and I were talking about it yesterday, and I told him I'll have to fix that. So when last time I said, and I was mistaken when I said it. I had the right idea in my mind, but I said it was the wrong person. Alexander the Great's the one that had the 4 generals that his kingdom was divided up into. I said Caesar. That's my fault. I had the right idea, wrong person. And I want to fix that. And it's divided up into four different groups. And the 4 different groups, we find out Egypt and Syria are two of those groups. And we mentioned in Daniel chapter 11, you got the north king and the south. Here's what we're dealing with, right? You've got Syria and Egypt. Well, what happens with that is you've got the feet and the toes are that kingdom mixed with other things, and we'll see what those other things are. When was the last time we saw something mingled with men? Was back in Genesis 6. Now, one of the problems with that is people say that, and we looked at the verse yesterday, that whenever they go into the kingdom, there's not going to be marriage or given in marriage, just as the angels are. And people say, well, angels aren't able to reproduce and all that stuff, and they can't marry and all that. But here's the thing. Angels are all men. So why can't they marry? Because they're all men. That's why they can't marry. It's not because they can't have... What did they do? They saw the daughters of men, and they looked fair, and what happened? We have giants. The reason they don't marry a given marriage is because God didn't create homosexual people, whether it was people here on earth or angels. So the reason they can't marry a given marriage is because they're all men. There's something that's going to take place over here too that we're going to see show up. And that's why, but here's the thing I want you to think about too, is if you think about this degenerates. And so what do we know about Satan's whole kingdom? Everything about it is what? It degenerates till it's completely wiped out. What do we know that God's going to end up doing is He's going to clean the heaven and the earth, right? Now, there's a lot there, and hopefully we're getting a little bit clearer picture. And like I said, I wanted to make sure I cleared that up. When you look at Alexander the Great, Greece is still in power. I mean, your New Testament is written in what? Ours is English, but the original was written in what? Koine Greek. Why? Because Rome was in power? No. There were still some issues there. What we're going to find out is these are still future. And we'll spend a little bit more time talking about those legs of iron and all that stuff moving forward. All right, so tons of questions, right? But what I wanted to make sure that we see is the purpose of all this stuff. And I want us to also think there's 5 parts, but there's only 4 kingdoms. This 4th kingdom is actually made weaker as you go through and you look at that. Okay. And I will say this, if you go through and you look at iron, oftentimes, not every time, but oftentimes iron is referred to in connection with the sons of God. And we'll spend a little bit more time on that. And clay is often referred to with men in Israel. So what you're going to have is where you've got this mingling down here. By the way, stop and think about this. When the Antichrist shows up, he's going to tell people that I'm what? Christ. So who's automatically going to say, yeah, we believe that he's the Christ? Jewish folks. Not anybody else. You know, you stop and you think about that. Who are those books, the Old Testament scriptures, who is it written to? Written to the nation of Israel. They should know some things. When they're coming through and they're understanding that stuff, they're going to be the ones that's going to say, he's the one fulfilling the verses. Not the guy back there, but this one. And they're going to fall for it. And what's going to happen is you're going to have that mingling together with those two kingdoms. Or that last kingdom actually split into two different parts. All right. Like I said, so we'll get that a little bit more. And by the way, we're here in the 70 years of 70 years of captivity. And what is it that God gives to Daniel is what? 70 weeks. How that fifth course is going to finish out. And we'll see some of those things a little bit more as we go along. All right. So, all right, we're out of time. I love this stuff. I don't know about you all. I hope I'm presenting in a way where it's we're still laying some groundwork, but hopefully we'll see this as we go through. You're going to see a nation that rises, and they're going to have a man who sets up a religious state just like what we see back here. And then he's going to sit in the throne and say, I'm God. The good news is we don't have to worry about that because we're going to be gone. But it's good for us to know. So